November 1970 recording from Dusseldorf, Germany. Influences: Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Beach Boys, Silver Apples, Pink Floyd, Sun Ra, Terry Riley, Moondog, and that is the band Kraftwerk. I like this combination, Joni Mitchell and Kraftwerk. So you got Ralph Hutter on Hammond organ and Tubon, which I'll put a picture up in a little while. It's a keyboard type instrument. Florian Schneider on flute, violin, electric percussion. Andreas Holman and Klaus Dinger on drums. All right, we've got Kraftwerk. We're going to listen to... What are we going to listen to? This one was tough, yeah. I had a couple that I really want to do, but we're going to listen to one. I have not heard any of this album yet, so this is a first listen. I think every other one of these I'm going to have are going to be new listens. So I'm trying to open myself up to some new music, at least 50% of the time. So this is Ruckzuck. Kraftwerk. Here we go. Okay, it seems like a good place to stop, as any. I have no idea where they're taking this, but yeah, so far, yeah, really cool. I like the flute, kind of sort of layering. So you got the drums, you have the, I don't know if I don't think they had any guitars in this, so I'm assuming that was keyboard doing the little dun, 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 dun. Cool little keyboard part. And so they got the drums, and they got some overlaying flutes done, very percussive, not much melodic, but definitely sort of really showcasing the percussive side of the flute. A lot of air, a lot of breathing. Anyway, so far, yeah, I really like it. I mean, obviously it's not like they're making a huge statement. It's like, they're just sort of, putting these textures out there for 1970. So I'll do some more sort of this period, late 60s, early 70s into the sort of krautrock and European styles and experimentations that were going on. Because that's somewhat new to me, and it's definitely something haven't explored. And while it's not like, this rainbow of treasure trove of the most wonderful music you've never heard before, but it's definitely it's really cool, and I can appreciate someone just doing sort of experimental for its own sake, not expecting not looking for number one hits or top 10, top 100 of the year for even experimental music, or ambient music or film music. It's just like bunch of guys, musicians, hanging out and being like, oh, let's just hit record, see what happens. It's a foundational, old as long as time for musicians to go ahead and do that. But does it end up on a record? Not typically. So let's see what happens. But that was really cool. It was a mix of stuff, and honestly, the best part of that for me, it sounded kind of like listening to similar to some of like Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Some of the jams on that were like Saucerful Secrets. Some of the longer jams where you're just kind of out in their space a little bit. But yeah, what really stood out was the sonic space that their instruments took, in the headphones, because they definitely were experimenting a lot with. It wasn't just like they had these sounds. They had, a handful of sounds in there. They had the flute, they had the keyboard, the drums, but it was what they were doing with it. The effects they had on some of the drums, like the flangers. I don't know what they were using for effects and how they were creating them, whether it was through what was available at the time or just the engineering. But the way that they were putting things into the space, the left to right, the front to back, with whatever effects, was really cool to hear. And it sounds like that's what they were, as the time was moving in linear, it's like they weren't changing the beats, they were just moving things around in the sort of space that you were hearing it. So that was interesting to hear. I could hear the fun that they were having and the experimentation. And if it was in real time, I think back then, they were kind of doing I don't know if I'm putting too much on it, but I have read that some of the methodology behind some of these music was to have things. It was almost like, there wasn't arranging, there wasn't all this planning, and there wasn't a creation in mind. It wasn't, the end result wasn't in your head. How are we going to achieve this? And having, first, chorus, and it was more spontaneous, stream of consciousness type of performance. So in that sense, you're not expecting the typical outcome of what you would have from a lot of music at that time. So anyway, we got a bit to go into Kraftwerk from just a first listen. So as far as the effects that I was talking about, it says these instruments often connected to further electronics via an electronic system studio's pitch to voltage converter. Von Himmelhoch has slight pitch curves that emulate the Doppler effect. So we're definitely hearing some interesting things with that. 1966, the Tubon, which I'm going to jump and throw a little bit of. Where is it? There we go. This is a picture of. This is a good picture I had. It was Paul McCartney in later years trying out the Tubon. But you can kind of see what they were going for. This is what was happening, the evolution of electronic keyboards at the time, and it looks like kind of one of those like guitars, but looks more like a bomb with a little not that many keys that built in there, maybe 20 or so keys. Anyway, the Tubon. It's a tubular, battery-powered monophonic keyboard instrument that was played standing up, supported around the neck, with a strap guitar style, allowing the performer freedom to move around the stage. Primarily designed as a bass instrument, it had 6 preset sounds with tuba, contrabass, electric bass, saxophone, electric bass, woodwind, and was commonly used by pop and folk bands in Sweden during the 1970s. Some groups like Can and Kraftwerk are so into feeling that when they go into the studio to make an album, they simply jam for a certain specified period, select the tapes they deem preferable, and edit them to manageable length. This is quite extraordinary considering the infrequency with which the average German group undertakes a recording session. Which, like I said, it's in some ways, I don't know, some people look at it as like a sloppy way and not always getting the best results, but you put in the quantity and sometimes you just look for the quality out of that, a lot of people do that nowadays. They just edit and cut and paste, Jimmy Page did that with the Song Remains the Same, right? He took the little bits of the 3 nights and put it all into one night, so it's not like they weren't, everyone kind of, used that method to some degree. In their place, a British band would be at each other's throats over whose songs were finally to be committed to the care of posterity, utilizing every studio facility to capture take after take of the numbers they had pre-planned. Nick Kent of the New Musical Express, 1974. Nick Kent slinks. The first thing you tend to notice about German rock bands is how mind-numbingly boring they are. But then, like I said, the music is basically boring, brain-belled boring, in fact, to the point that only an even more banal musical form like reggae could overtake it and become, in effect, the elitist in sound of 1973. I'm just trying to put out some context there of different viewpoints at the time, which, up until he threw reggae under the bus, I could say, I could listen to his perspective, but I don't know, reggae, I can't really call it banal musical form, but anyway, still, Virgin Records has kept its krautrock section intact in their catalog, while balding intellectuals like Ian MacDonald can be heard occasionally muttering earnestly about the undeveloped potential inherent in the contemporary German music culture. And then again, now we've had time to focus in and reflect our way through the wheat and the chaff, and we can discriminate between the vast amount of direct and those few stout-hearted krauts who have set out, facial muscles characteristically tensed up as they lurch maniacally over their various keyboard instruments, and actually succeeded in pushing musical frontiers a little bit further into the more accessible areas of the nouveau avant-garde. A lot of good words in there. Bands like Neu and Kraftwerk are a little more than experimental quacks, occasionally hitting on an intriguing conceptual sequence without bothering to follow through and compound its initial spark. I can't really. I'm just putting stuff out there. I'm looking for context of people at the time. Obviously the critics of the time I think is important because it's nice to hear people at the time. It's within a context of other music at the time, and sometimes it's music takes years, decades to be to be heard in a different way. So it's kind of interesting to hear, at the time. And I'm certainly as prone to that as anybody else. Depending on when I hear something, can directly affect my opinion of it. But for me, in the little bit that I've heard Kraftwerk, I can't necessarily have a very negative viewpoint of it. To me, I feel like the intent is honorable. Even if they're following through and they're, to other musical styles like what do you call it, like Pink Floyd. They didn't search out the melodic accessibility the way other groups did, or maybe it's like Frank Zappa. So I don't know. Overall, what I heard, in its short span, if I was to hear the whole album, it might be bring out a little bit bigger context for me as far as the overall output. But in its span, I'd say for 7 minutes, I think it could have certainly contextually, been put in a little bit better, accessible, digestible fashion if it was a little compressed a little bit time-wise. But it was interesting to listen to in the time that I'm listening to it. So I'm happy with that.